How good was Nobby Stiles? That is the question when legends like Sir Bobby Charlton and George Best praise a man who looked like he had no business on a football pitch. A 5'6" midfielder with severe myopia, needing thick contact lenses just to see, missing several teeth giving him a gap-toothed grin, and a premature comb-over. Alan Mullery, his England teammate, summed it up perfectly when he said Stiles could not run, could not see, and had no teeth. It was brutal, but seemed accurate. This was supposed to be a player at the highest level of world football, yet he looked like someone who had wandered on by accident. And yet, when you hear what the greatest players actually said, when Charlton calls him the heart and soul, when Best declares him the toughest player he knew, and the first name you would want in a fight, you realise something extraordinary. There was a massive gap between what Nobby Stiles looked like and what he meant to the game. So how did this unlikely figure become the beating heart of England's 1966 World Cup victory and Manchester United's greatest European triumph? The answer starts with what happened when Nobby Stiles died in 2020 at 78. Football stopped. Flags at Old Trafford flew at half-mast. Minutes of silence were observed. Tributes poured in from everywhere. Charlton called him a titan. Beckham called him a true gentleman. Southgate said he was an inspiration. Denis Law admitted he was glad Stiles was his teammate more often than his opponent. Ferguson revealed that Busby said letting Stiles go was the worst mistake he ever made. This was recognition of what this man had done for football. To understand why, you need to see the physical paradox. Born in 1942 in a cellar during a Manchester air raid, he grew up in Collyhurst. His father was an undertaker, his mother a machinist. It instilled a no-nonsense work ethic. But physically, Stiles was an anomaly. At 5 feet 6 inches and 68 kilograms, he was small. His severe myopia meant thick spectacles off-pitch and contact lenses during games. The missing teeth, the balding head with its comb-over created an intimidating presence, but not as a traditional athlete should be. Mullery's insult reflected genuine confusion. How could someone like this compete? The answer was simple. Nobby Stiles was not there to look good. He was there to do the job no one else wanted. He was the enforcer who won the ball and gave it to someone who could play. George Best said Stiles was the toughest player he ever knew, the first name you would want in a fight. This was about relentless will and the intelligence to break up the opposition's game. Stiles had a low centre of gravity for tight marking. His poor eyesight forced positional intuition. His gap-toothed appearance was intimidating. His high aerobic capacity enabled relentless man marking for 90 to 120 minutes. But most importantly, he was humble and selfless. Nicky Butt called him the most humble man he met. This willingness to sacrifice glory for team balance made him special. The man who understood this was Sir Alf Ramsey. When Ramsey took over England in 1963, he promised a World Cup victory based on a new philosophy. He abandoned traditional wingers, creating the wingless wonders, requiring a midfield capable of immense defensive work. Ramsey identified Stiles as his enforcer with a clear directive: win the ball and give it to Bobby Charlton. This mantra became the foundation of 1966 success. Ramsey referred to Stiles as one of his 4 world-class players, alongside Banks, Moore, and Charlton. It stunned those who prioritised flair over function. If you are giving your support right now, I would love it if you could give some hype to this video. It helps us keep making content like this. Just hit that hype button. Now back to how Ramsey proved his belief in Stiles. Following a group stage match against France in 1966, Stiles committed a late, aggressive tackle on Jackie Simon that drew international condemnation. The Football Association Selection Committee demanded his removal from the squad. They viewed Stiles as a liability, unfit to wear the England shirt. But Ramsey's response remains one of the most significant moments in managerial history. He flatly refused to drop Stiles. He told the committee, "If Stiles does not play, I do not play." Ramsey threatened to resign in the middle of a home World Cup. This was not just loyalty to a player, it was calculated. Ramsey knew his system would collapse without the spoiler to neutralize the sophisticated playmakers of Argentina, Portugal, and West Germany. Stiles would repay this faith in the tournament's most important matches. The semi-final against Portugal provided the definitive proof of Stiles' tactical importance. Ramsey's instruction before the match was simple and direct. "Nobby, I want you to take Eusebio out of the game. Eusebio, known as the Black Panther, was at the absolute height of his powers, and arguably the most dangerous attacker in all of Europe at that time. What followed was a masterclass in suffocating man-marking that would be studied for decades. Eusebio later admitted that he found Stiles incredibly frustrating. He described a sensation of being unable to breathe, let alone play football. For 89 minutes, Stiles disrupted his rhythm, cut off his space, and never let him settle. Eusebio's only significant contribution in the match was a late penalty. The rest of the time, he was a ghost. This performance set the template for what would later be called the holding midfielder role, a defensive shield that players like Claude Makelele would popularize decades later. But in 1966, it was revolutionary. It proved that you could neutralize brilliance not by matching it, but by suffocating it. While the 1966 World Cup brought Stiles national fame and recognition across England, his career at Manchester United from 1960 to 1971 was where he established his daily reputation as a true titan of the game. Under the legendary Sir Matt Busby, Stiles was the defensive anchor for a side that boasted the united trinity of Bobby Charlton, Denis Law and George Best. Charlton's assessment of Stiles provides the deepest insight into what he actually meant to the team and why he was so valued. Charlton called him the heart and soul, a ball of fire who gave us the freedom to play. That phrase, "gave us the freedom to play," is the key to understanding Stiles' entire career. The presence of an enforcer does not just subtract from the opposition, it adds to the capability of your own creative players. By taking on the dirty work and the physical burden of midfield combat, Stiles removed the defensive load from Charlton and Best. They could stay high up the pitch and focus on offensive transitions because they knew Stiles was behind them, winning the ball back and immediately giving it to the people who could actually play. Denis Law, the Scottish striker, had a complex relationship with Stiles. They were close club teammates but fierce international rivals. Law described Stiles as a top player and a top man who was immensely popular in the dressing room. But the competitive fire that Stiles possessed was legendary. Sir Alex Ferguson recounted a telling story at Denis Law's funeral. Stiles, who reportedly worshipped Law, once bounded down the tunnel before an England-Scotland match to wish him well. Law, a fierce competitor who loved beating England, responded with a withering look and a volley of abuse that Nobby never forgot. This story highlights the intense professional environment of the era. Even between close friends and club teammates, the enforcer role demanded total commitment to the psychological battle of the pitch. Between 1960 and 1971, Stiles made around 395 appearances for Manchester United across all competitions. He won the First Division title in 1964-65 and 1966-67. He won the FA Cup in 1962-63, but the crowning achievement was the 1967-68 European Cup, when Manchester United became the first English club to lift the prestigious European trophy. His style as a defensive midfielder and halfback was defined by ball winning and immediate distribution to Charlton and Best. He was not there to create, he was there to win it and give it. The 1968 European Cup final against Benfica at Wembley was the emotional culmination of Sir Matt Busby's journey after the tragic Munich air disaster. And once again, the tactical narrative centered on the battle between Stiles and Eusebio. Benfica manager Otto Gloria had criticized Stiles before the match, calling him an assassin, brutal, and a bad sportsman. It was the kind of continental disdain for the English hard man archetype that Stiles had faced throughout his career. But on the pitch, Stiles remained disciplined. Eusebio managed to break free once late in normal time, but he was denied by a legendary save from Alex Stepney. Pat Crerand, Stiles' midfield partner, recalled that his heart sank when Eusebio broke through, and the collective relief when Stepney made the save was immense. Stiles' overall containment of Eusebio was a primary reason the game reached extra time. Brian Kidd, who scored on his 19th birthday in that final, later emphasized that the engine room of the team, led by Stiles, was what allowed the stars to shine in the additional 30 minutes. As Benfica tired, Stiles' stamina and relentless work rate gave United the platform to win. But the narrative of Nobby Stiles is not without its darker chapters. The 1968 Intercontinental Cup against the Argentine side, Estudiantes de La Plata, exposed the brutal reality of being labelled an enforcer. In the first leg in Argentina, Stiles was relentlessly targeted with punches, kicks, and headbutts. Carlos Bilardo, a particularly aggressive member of the Estudiantes side, focused his efforts on Stiles, and the referees appeared to favour the home team. Stiles was eventually sent off in the 79th minute for retaliating after being incessantly hounded. This episode illustrated a broader trend. As the designated hard man, Stiles was often denied the same protection from officials that flair players received. The perception of him as a clogger or dirty player by continental and South American critics made him a target for premeditated provocation. It was the price he paid for his role. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Nobby Stiles came after his playing days ended. In 1989, Sir Alex Ferguson made a strategic decision to bring Stiles back to Old Trafford as a youth coach. This was central to Ferguson's reinvigoration of the club's youth setup. Stiles, working alongside Eric Harrison, was tasked with mentoring the class of '92, a group that included David Beckham, Ryan Giggs, Paul Scholes, Nicky Butt, and the Neville brothers. The influence he exerted on these young players was profound. Number 5. Ryan Giggs learned about fighting for the shirt from Stiles, an attitude that would make him the most decorated player in English football history. Giggs' longevity and commitment to Manchester United can be directly traced back to the lessons Stiles taught about what it meant to wear the red shirt. Number 4. Paul Scholes absorbed lessons about vision and competitive edge from Stiles. Scholes would go on to become one of United's greatest creative midfielders, but his work rate and tactical discipline were shaped by the man who coached him as a teenager. Number 3. David Beckham expressed eternal gratitude for the support and passion Stiles showed him as a young kid. Beckham noted that learning from a World Cup winner was extra special. Stiles taught him about grit and determination, qualities that turned Beckham into a global superstar with a relentless work rate focus. Number 2. Nicky Butt described Stiles as a godlike figure and emphasized that despite his legendary status, he was the most humble man Butt had ever met. Stiles taught Butt about tactical discipline and humility, shaping him into a functional holding midfielder who would win 6 Premier League titles. The role Stiles pioneered in the 1960s lived on through Butt in the 1990s. Number 1. Gary Neville recalled that Stiles taught them that your studs are your best friends. It was a lesson in defensive tenacity and club loyalty that defined Neville's entire career. Stiles instilled a level of competitive intensity that matched his own playing days, ensuring that the next generation understood what it meant to fight for everything. Sir Alex Ferguson noted that Stiles had a deep knowledge of the game and an infectious personality that left a lasting impact on every player he touched. Ferguson specifically pointed to Stiles' influence as a heart and soul figure who helped bridge the gap between the Busby era and the modern success of the 1990s. Without Stiles' coaching, the class of '92 might never have developed the mentality that would dominate English football for over a decade. When football historians analyse the evolution of the holding midfielder, Stiles is increasingly recognised as a pioneer of a role that is now standard in all elite teams. In the 1960s, midfield lines were often porous, and the distinction between defensive and offensive duties was less defined. Stiles was among the first to play as a pure holding midfielder, a man marker by vocation and a ball winner by instinct. His tactical intelligence was often underestimated. He read danger early, positioned himself with scientific precision, and understood exactly when to engage and when to hold his ground. This defensive intelligence allowed him to facilitate the brilliance of others. Without Stiles, the wingless wonders of 1966 would have lacked the balance to survive the counterattacks of West Germany. Without Stiles, the Manchester United of 1968 would have been too top-heavy to withstand the technical superiority of Benfica. Modern analysis frequently compares Stiles to Claude Makelele or Massimo Bonini, players whose greatness was defined by their ability to turn talent into trophies through tactical sacrifice. Stiles was a stabilizer who disrupted the opposition's rhythm and immediately handed the ball over to more gifted teammates. This selflessness is a rare commodity in professional sports, and it is why Stiles remains such a revered figure among his peers. When Stiles passed away in 2020, after a long struggle with Alzheimer's and prostate cancer, Sir Geoff Hurst, the hat-trick hero of 1966, described him as a great character and a great person to have in the squad. Hurst emphasised that beyond the tactical utility, Stiles brought a levity and spirit to the dressing room that was vital during the intense pressure of a World Cup. This dual nature, the ball of fire on the pitch and the humble gentleman off it, is the core of the Stiles legend. In the final analysis, Nobby Stiles represents the vital, often invisible foundation upon which the greatest successes of English football were built. Alan Mullery's observation about his physical limitations was factually grounded, but it failed to account for the revolutionary functionalism that Stiles brought to the pitch. By not letting you breathe, as Eusebio so poignantly described, Stiles redefined the defensive midfielder from a passive observer to an active disruptor. His career serves as a reminder that the most significant players are not always the ones who command the headlines, but the ones who create the tactical conditions for greatness to manifest. From the cellars of Collyhurst to the balcony of Buckingham Palace, Stiles' journey was a triumph of character over circumstance. He remains the toothless tiger of Wembley, the godlike figure of the United Academy, and the tactical titan who proved that in a game of flair, the most essential player is often the one who wins the ball and gives it to someone else. If you enjoyed hearing about how Nobby Stiles changed football forever, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the legends who shaped the game. Drop a comment below and let us know which player you want us to cover next. Thanks for watching.
They were towards me, and how I've said on many occasions how they made me as a player. I was kind of a player that didn't need a rollicking off the gaffer, else I would crumble. I needed a pat on the back, and the pat on the back was given to me by the supporters. Yeah, I know they still talk about me as the best player they've ever been on Stoke.
How good was Jimmy Greenhoff? When Sir Matt Busby and Don Revie sat down to talk about football, they both had the same answer. They called him a star. They called him the real deal. They called him the player everyone else seemed to forget. Here is the story of the greatest footballer England never selected, told through the eyes of the legends who actually knew him best. This is a story about talent recognizing talent. This is a story about the gap between what the best players understood and what the average eye could see. Jimmy Greenhoff was not just any forward. He was what players call a player's player, the kind of talent that made other professionals stop and stare, the kind of skill that reached across a football pitch and said something important to everyone watching. Somehow, his name never appeared on the England team sheet. Not once. Not for the senior side anyway. This is the real history of a footballer who deserves to be remembered as one of the greatest his era produced. His name should have been mentioned in the same breath as Best, Charlton and Law, but it wasn't. This video explains why it should have been. If you're enjoying this story so far, please use the hype feature and give this video some hype. It really helps us out. Now let's dive deeper. Young Jimmy was born in Barnsley in 1946. By age 15, Don Revie was calling him a star. Not in some vague, encouraging way a coach talks to a kid. Revie was a serious man, a tactical master, built Leeds United into one of the best and most dominant teams in Europe. When Revie identified a player, people listened. He watched Jimmy hold his own against older, stronger players in the Northern Intermediate League. Revie saw something special. He saw a sharp football brain. He saw a future champion. In June 1961, Jimmy signed apprentice forms at Leeds United. He joined a legendary group that included Paul Reaney, Norman Hunter and Terry Cooper. This was Don Revie's nursery. This was where Revie discovered and shaped the players who would dominate England for years. Jimmy was part of that brilliant group. In 1960 and 1961, he won the English Schools Trophy with Barnsley boys. He was among the very best young talents in the entire north of England. Decision came in May 1963. Revie gave Jimmy his senior debut at age 16 years and 330 days. Some people thought the kid was too young. Revie stood firm, said the boy needed experience, and now was exactly the right time to give it to him. The debut came against Southampton. From that moment on, Jimmy's journey truly began. He played as a right half and winger at first, doing whatever the team needed. But Revie was watching. Revie was planning. In 1967, Jimmy was getting plenty of attention from bigger clubs. Manchester United wanted him. Liverpool wanted him. Everyone wanted him. But Revie made it clear. He said Jimmy was not for sale at any price. That was how much Revie believed in him. That was how much he valued what Jimmy could become at Leeds. Enter Sid Owen, the Leeds chief coach. While Revie handled the big picture, Owen shaped the technical side of the game. He transformed Greenhoff's abilities into something truly special. Owen looked at Jimmy and saw a lovely mover, a great centre forward who always looked the part. His first touch was assured and excellent. His movement was efficient and graceful. His distribution was intelligent. His self-control was very good, even under the worst pressure from defenders. Owen said Jimmy never got overexcited. In an era when forwards took punishment from opposing players and abuse from crowds, Jimmy stayed calm. He stayed professional. He stayed focused on the pass and the run rather than getting caught up in the rough stuff. This composure was not laziness. It was discipline. It was the mark of a true professional athlete. Owen believed Jimmy's distribution made him much more than a traditional striker. He was a creative force who could start scoring moves as easily as he could finish them. Journalists of the time compared Jimmy's constructive play to the legendary Danny Blanchflower. He was that level of creative midfielder wrapped up in a forward's body. But Revie and Leeds eventually decided Jimmy lacks the raw stamina for their intense midfield system. His intelligent distribution would be used better up front. He could conserve energy better as a striker. He could be more explosive in the penalty area. So they made the move. They moved him forward. It was the right call. In August 1969, Birmingham City could not hold on to him anymore. Jimmy had scored 14 goals in 31 league games. He once netted 4 goals against Fulham in a single game. Stoke City came calling. The fee was £100,000. It was a club record for Stoke. It showed what Tony Waddington believed about this player. Waddington was a manager who loved technical skill. He loved football played with intelligence and grace. Critics said Jimmy was lazy. This label followed technical players everywhere in those days. Their movement was so efficient and smooth that people without real football knowledge thought they were not working hard enough. Waddington knew better. He called Jimmy technically gifted. Said Jimmy had an innate understanding of space and timing. Waddington declared that Jimmy was the creative heartbeat of his Stoke City team. That was not a compliment. That was a statement of absolute fact. At Stoke, Jimmy started with powerful midfielder John Ritchie. Jimmy would be the bridge between midfield and the striker position. He would feed off Ritchie's knockdowns. He would bring the wide players into the game. He created a multi-dimensional attack that made Stoke a genuinely dangerous and feared opponent week after week. Opposition managers had to think about how to stop him. They had to adjust their systems. They had to respect his technical ability and his understanding of space. Then, in 1974, Alan Hudson arrived. Hudson was a playmaker with enormous talent. When Hudson met Greenhoff, magic happened. A link-up play is still talked about by fans today. Hudson would find Greenhoff with pinpoint accuracy. Greenhoff would move into space with natural skill. Their chemistry was almost telepathic. The football they played together was some of the most elegant the Victoria Ground had ever seen. During the 1972-73 season, Jimmy finished as Stoke's top scorer with 20 goals. He scored a hat-trick against Manchester City. This was peak form. This was what happened when you gave him the right partner and the right system. The previous season, Stoke had won the League Cup. That victory at Wembley against Chelsea in the 1972 League Cup final had Jimmy's fingerprints all over it. He was pivotal in that moment. Hudson and Greenhoff understood each other at a level beyond normal. They were both past masters at the chemistry of football. They knew that the real beauty of a goal often came from the collective move before it. Stoke supporters took enormous pride in watching them. These two players represented something different from the industrial football that dominated the English First Division. Their football was elegant. It was intelligent. It prioritized ball control and thinking. Now let's talk about George Best. Best was arguably the most iconic player of the era. He was the yardstick by which all other attacking players were measured. Yet when Best played against Greenhoff, when they shared the same pitch, Jimmy often stood out just as much. In the 1971-72 FA Cup quarter-final at Old Trafford, George Best scored in the 85th minute. Everyone thought that was the match, but Greenhoff equalised. He earned Stoke a replay. This was not just any goal. This was a demonstration that Greenhoff had the same big-game temperament as the greatest players in the world. Stoke won the replay. Greenhoff had proved something important. There was a key difference between Best and Greenhoff, though. Both had what people called instinctive and beautiful play. Both were described as being in a class of their own, but Best's career at the highest level did not last. He lived a fast life. He lost his discipline. His peak was brilliant but brief. Greenhoff was a model pro. He maintained high standards well into his 30s. When his physical pace slowed, his brain had lost none of its awareness. He could inspire revivals. He could score spectacular goals through positioning and technique. He was playing excellent football at age 33, while Best had faded years before. Then came January 1976. A devastating windstorm hit the Victoria Ground. It destroyed the Butler Street stand. The repair bill was £250,000. Stoke City had absolutely no money. The club faced financial disaster. They had to sell their best players. They had to sell Alan Hudson. They had to sell John Mahoney. They had to sell Jimmy Greenhoff. Tony Waddington was heartbroken. Jimmy was his greatest signing. Jimmy represented everything Waddington believed about the game, but the bills had to be paid. So Waddington made a phone call. He called Sir Matt Busby at Manchester United. Waddington knew Manchester United was the only club worthy of Jimmy's talent. Waddington knew Busby would value what Jimmy brought to football. When word reached Jimmy that Sir Matt Busby personally wanted him at United, everything changed. This was the deciding factor. Jimmy had wanted to stay at Stoke. He was unhappy about being forced out, but when Sir Matt Busby calls, when a manager with Busby's reputation and history reaches out, a player listens. Busby had seen the very best in world football, managed Bobby Charlton and George Best. When Busby wanted you, it meant something truly important. The transfer fee was approximately £111,000, though some reports say £120,000. The negotiations reflected the high regard in which Busby held the 31-year-old forward. Tommy Docherty was the Manchester United manager, and he wanted the deal done, but Busby's approval was needed. Busby recognised that Jimmy's age did not matter. Jimmy was a player who relied on intelligence rather than speed. He was a bargain even in his 30s. Here is something remarkable. Jimmy actually signed for Manchester United on lower wages than he had been receiving at Stoke City. This shows you what motivated him. Money was not the point. He wanted to test himself at the highest level. He wanted to play for Manchester United. He wanted to play under Busby's influence. He wanted to join his brother Brian at Old Trafford. Jimmy's impact was immediate. He partnered with striker Stuart Pearson. Together, they formed a formidable attacking duo. Docherty's Manchester United was young and energetic. Players like Lou Macari, Sammy McIlroy, and Steve Coppell gave the team pace and drive. Jimmy provided veteran poise. He provided technical finish, provided the experience that Doc's army needed. The pinnacle came in the 1977 FA Cup final. Manchester United faced Liverpool, a team chasing a historic treble. The match was tense, the pressure was enormous, and the stakes could not have been higher. Then, Lou Macari shot. Ball hit Jimmy's chest. It deflected past the Liverpool goalkeeper. Manchester United won 2-1. Jimmy Greenhoff had won an FA Cup. He had ended Liverpool's treble dreams. He had done it with an instinctive goal that showed perfect positioning. During the 1978-79 season, Jimmy finished as Manchester United's top scorer with 17 goals. The supporters voted him Player of the Year. This was a player who should have been playing for England. This was a player everyone wanted to watch, yet he never earned a senior England cap. He represented England at the under-23 level 5 times between 1968 and 1976. He even scored on his debut against Wales, but the senior side never called. The national managers at the time, first Sir Alf Ramsey and then Don Revie, often preferred physical durability and rigid tactical adherence over the fluid, creative skill that Jimmy represented. While club managers like Waddington and Busby recognised that his distribution and skill were tremendous assets, national managers struggled to fit such a versatile, deep-lying forward into their systems. 1970s were full of talented mavericks. Tony Curry, Alan Hudson, Frank Worthington and Stan Bowles all struggled to earn caps as well. Yet Jimmy was more of a model pro than any of them. He was more reliable, he was more consistent. Still, he fell into the same category. He was seen as too technical for what English football needed. Stoke supporters remain adamant to this day that he was the greatest England player of his generation to be ignored by national selectors. After leaving Manchester United in 1980, Jimmy had a brief spell at Crewe Alexandra. He played for Toronto Blizzard in the North American Soccer League. He came back to the Potteries to play for Port Vale. At Port Vale, he scored a famous 30-yard volley against York City that fans still talk about today. Even in the twilight of his career, the magic was still there. His management career was brief. He served as player-manager at Rochdale in the early 1980s, following his former mentor, Tony Waddington. But results did not go his way. He resigned in 1984. His involvement in professional football ended there. The post-football years were hard. A failed insurance venture left him in financial distress. He lost his home. He lost his FA Cup winners' medal, though he refused to sell it until circumstance absolutely forced him to. Despite these personal trials, his status remained unchanged. He worked in pharmaceutical companies and warehouses in Stoke-on-Trent. He remained beloved in the community. When he appeared at the Victoria Ground as a spectator years after leaving Stoke, the Boothen end would chant his name. There was a lump in his throat. This level of idolization is rare. It is reserved for players who offered something truly special. For Stoke supporters, Jimmy was more than a footballer. He was a symbol of their greatest era. He was a source of pride and joy. At Manchester United, fans remembered his dedication and skill. They remembered the FA Cup final goal. They remembered his ability to win over 2 major clubs, each with their own high standards. So what was Jimmy Greenhoff? He was a player's player. He was technically gifted. He was a creative heartbeat. He was a lovely mover who always looked the part. He was never overexcited. He never got caught up in the rough stuff. He stayed professional. He stayed focused on the football. When Sir Matt Busby personally reached out to sign a 31-year-old, it was a definitive statement of that player's quality. When Don Revie identified a 15-year-old as a star, it validated early brilliance. When George Best had to share the headlines, it marked that player as elite. Jimmy Greenhoff bridged the gap between rigid tactics and creative freedom. His first touch, his distribution, and his lovely movement were the marks of a footballer who understood the game at a level few could match. Whether at the Victoria Ground or Old Trafford, he represented the aesthetic ideal of football. He played with intelligence, he played with grace, played with unwavering commitment to the technical craft. His legacy as the greatest never to play for England serves as a permanent reminder of a time when natural skill was the ultimate currency in the game. The legends knew it, the fans knew it, the stadiums knew it. Everyone who truly understood the beautiful game knew it. Jimmy Greenhoff was, in every sense, a true and undeniable legend of English football throughout his career.
A good captain, maybe a little bit of a bully. I liked everybody else to be doing their work, you know, and it went well that way.
Well, Ronnie Yates was one of the cornerstones here at Liverpool. His coming, along with Ian St John around the same time, was the very beginning of Liverpool's rise.
How good was Ron Yates? That question haunts football history because the answer matters more than you think. Imagine being a giant, a mountain of a man, someone who dominated every pitch you walked on, and then imagine that memory slipping away. That is what happened to Ron Yates in his later years. Heavy leather footballs and repetitive heading in the 1960s left invisible marks on his brain. Alzheimer's disease crept in. The mind that organized defenses began to fade. Even legends pay a cost. But as his memory dimmed, his legacy blazed brighter than ever. When you talk to the legends who faced him, played beside him, and watched him transform Liverpool, you understand something profound. Ron Yates was the foundation upon which an entire era was built. Today, we hear what Shankley called him a colossus. We discover why Sir Bobby Charlton felt suffocated by his presence. This is how one man became the mountain that made everyone around him braver. If this video is helping you understand football history, give it some hype. Just hit that button right now. Let us start with Tommy Smith, because his story ties everything together at the end of Yates's Liverpool journey. Smith came to Anfield as a young defender, and he saw Ron Yates and saw a father figure, a mentor. Smith became the Iron Man of Anfield, but he learned everything from Yates. The partnership between them was one of the fiercest defensive units in English football history. They provided the backbone for 2 league titles and the club's first FA Cup. Smith spoke about Yates constantly, about the mental toughness he showed, about fixing mistakes before they became problems. The Anfield way meant everyone was a captain. All 11 players took responsibility. Standards were non-negotiable. Yates, as the second longest-serving captain in Liverpool's history at retirement, embodied that completely, led by setting standards, making sure younger players understood that mediocrity was not allowed. Under his guidance, players were integrated into a family atmosphere, but it was a family with strict rules. Yates influenced Smith so deeply that it shaped the entire style of play he became famous for. That effective, no-nonsense defensive approach that dominated the First Division came directly from watching Yates work. Smith learned that football at the highest level was about getting the job done and executing with precision. Now let us move to Billy McNeill. McNeill played for Celtic, and he was doing something similar to what Yates was doing at Liverpool. Both were powerful, athletic centre-halves who pioneered a new kind of defender. Before them, centre-halves mostly just blocked things, but McNeill and Yates were different. They were organisers. They were leaders. They could think tactically. Yates had captained every team he ever played for. Shankley saw that and knew it was what he needed. The centre-half role in the 1960s was changing, moving from stationary stopper to dynamic organiser. Yates was at the front of that evolution. Yes, he was a brutish stopper when needed, but his real strength was his assured presence. That presence gave security to teammates. This archetype was crucial for European competition. Leaders like Yates helped bring professionalism and discipline to European matches. McNeill represented the same thing at Celtic, and together, these Scottish powerhouses showed that the centre-half could be more than muscle. He could be a brain. He could be a leader who elevated everyone around him simply by doing his job at the highest level. Roger Hunt was one of the great goal scorers of Liverpool's golden era, and he gave us a different angle on Yates. Hunt saw Yates as the bedrock. That was his word, bedrock. He said Yates was a firm platform, something you could build on, something that would not crack under pressure. Hunt was focused on his own craft, on practicing shooting on the turn, on the technical details that made him lethal in the penalty box, but he knew none of it meant anything without Yates behind him. The defence had to be rock solid. Goalkeeper had to be assured. The centre-half had to be immovable. That was what Yates was. Hunt respected that because he understood that great attacking play happens in the shadow of great defending. During Yates's early years at Liverpool, he had military obligations. He was stationed in the army at Aldershot, and he suffered from severe travel sickness. Think about that for a moment. Think about suffering from travel sickness so bad that you can barely get through a journey and then choosing to travel over 1,000 miles every single week to play football. That is commitment. That is the kind of standard Yates set. He would take the train and the coach for hours, feeling ill the entire way, because he believed in the commitment he had made to his teammates. Hunt watched that. He saw Yates doing that week after week, never complaining, never asking for special treatment, just showing up and being brilliant. That became the culture at Liverpool. That became what it meant to play for the club. For Hunt, it was why Yates was so crucial, not just because he was tall and strong, but because he was a symbol of the standards Liverpool was building. He was proof that you gave everything. He was proof that you did not chase the game recklessly, but rather maintained the discipline required to exploit chances when they came. Hunt scored so many goals because behind him there was a player like Yates, who made sure the opposition never had time to settle, never had space to plan attacks. Now let us talk about Ian St John, and this is where the human side of Yates really comes through. St John and Yates arrived at Liverpool around the same time, became best mates, proper best mates. Their arrival marked the very beginning of Liverpool's rise from being a nothing club to being a powerhouse. John was a striker, and he needed to believe in what was happening around him. He needed to feel secure. When he first met Yates, he thought Yates was the coach. That is how much of an authority figure Yates was. Just his presence, his stature, his aura of leadership made you think that this man had to be the one in charge. But it was more than just physical intimidation. St John described Yates as a brilliant tackler, someone feared by opponents. But what really mattered was what Yates was like inside the team. Inside Liverpool, Yates was an encourager. He was not a critic. He was not someone who made teammates feel small. He lifted people up. He gave them confidence. That mental belief and security is exactly what St John and the attacking players needed. When you know that a mountain of a man is behind you, when you know that he will not let anything get past him, when you know he has your back, you can take risks, you can be creative, you can score goals for fun. That is exactly what Liverpool did during this period. They scored goals for fun because the attacking players had the freedom that only comes from absolute faith in the defence. The logic was simple but devastating. If Yates neutralises the counter-attack, then our attacking players can push higher up the pitch. They can take chances. They can commit extra numbers forward because they trust that Yates will stop anything coming back at them. St John remained Yates's best mate for life. Even when Yates was struggling with Alzheimer's in his later years, St John was there. That bond, forged during the Shankley Revolution, never broke. That tells you something about the quality of the man. The teammates who knew him best, who played alongside him, who saw him every single day. They loved him, not respected him, loved him. That is rare in football. That is very rare. That truly speaks to character. Finally, let us get to the heart of it all. Let us talk about Shankley and the era that defined everything. Bill Shankley arrived at Liverpool in 1959 and he looked around the club and he was disgusted by what he found. The club was happy-go-lucky, it was slap-happy, content to exist in mediocrity. The directors were fine with being just a few places from the bottom of the First Division. Shankley found that appalling. He believed that football clubs had to have standards, had to have ambition, had to have a clear vision for what they wanted to become. To make that happen, he needed a specific type of player. He did not just want technical skill, he wanted heart, he wanted commitment. He wanted players whose internal fire matched his own vision. In 1961, Shankley identified a player at Dundee United named Ron Yates, and he knew immediately that this was his man. This was the structural anchor he needed for everything else to work. When Yates arrived at Anfield, Shankley did something brilliant. He called a press conference and he invited all the journalists to come and take a walk around his centre half. He told them that Yates was a colossus, a mountain. He was doing two things at once. He was making a genuine assessment of Yates's physical and mental qualities, but he was also creating a brand, a psychological image of impregnability that opponents would have to confront every single week. It was calculated and it worked perfectly. By comparing Yates to a mountain, Shankley established a landscape where the opposition felt small. They felt powerless. The image of Liverpool's defence became about a man who could not be moved, who could not be passed, who was simply too big and too dominant to overcome. Yates became the spine of the team. It was not just physical, it was psychological. It was about the message that Liverpool sent to opponents. When you look at Liverpool, you see a mountain. When you face Liverpool, you face something immovable. Yates was the embodiment of that message. Shankley did have one initial concern about Yates though. When the manager first worked with him, he thought Yates might be too gentle. Yates had good manners. He was not the type to throw elbows or go looking for trouble. So Shankley coached him. Shankley taught him aggression. He taught him how to use his body. He taught him how to dominate physically in ways that were legal, but absolutely effective. Yates learned. He absorbed the lessons. He became not just physically dominant, but aggressively present in a way that changed how centre-halves could operate. Other managers started asking their centre-halves why they could not be more like Yates. Shankley often joked that he could have a comedian in goal and still win matches because Yates was so dominant at the back. That was not really a joke. That was Shankley's way of saying that Yates was so effective at the base of the defence that almost anything could happen in front of him, the team would still get the result. The transformation of Liverpool was remarkable. Pre-Yates, the club was in the second division, stagnant, going nowhere. Post-Yates, the club got promoted. The club won the first division title. The club won the FA Cup. The club built a culture around leadership and standards and commitment. Shankley called it the 11 captains model. Every player was a captain in his own area. Every player had to take responsibility. Every player had to maintain standards. But it all started with Yates. It all flowed from the centre-half position outward. Yates's physical presence was crucial. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, but it was not just the height, it was the way he used his body. He had an incredible sense of timing in the air. He understood leverage. He knew how to position himself so that he could shield the ball from opponents and win headers with authority. He did not just jump, he owned the air. Opponents knew that when the ball went high, Yates was going to win it. That certainty changed how Liverpool could play. Because Yates won the initial ball, team could transition into the pass and move system. They could play football the way Shankley envisioned it. Quick, aggressive, committed, and utterly dominating. The 1960s in English football was an era of aerial duels. The long ball was a primary weapon. It was physical and it was demanding. Sir Bobby Charlton, perhaps the greatest creative force of that era, acknowledged that Yates was suffocating to play against. Charlton struggled to create space in the final third because Yates occupied so much of the pitch. He made the pitch feel smaller. He suffocated opposition attacks before they could develop. That is an incredible compliment when you think about it. And Bobby Charlton is saying that you made football difficult for him. You were doing something extraordinary. Yates's background made him perfect for what Shankley needed. He was born in 1937 in Aberdeen, and he grew up in a neighbourhood full of bomb craters from the Second World War. That was not an easy place. That was not soft. People who grew up in that environment learned about toughness early. Before he became a footballer, Yates worked as a butcher's apprentice in a slaughterhouse. He started at 3 in the morning. He worked with his hands. Trained as a mason, he understood physical labor. He understood how to build things from raw materials. That was his background. That was his foundation. Shankley recognized that immediately. Shankley was obsessed with heart and commitment, and Yates had both in abundance because his life had demanded it. His background made him credible to the supporters. He was not some kid who had been coddled. He was a working-class man who had made something of himself through sheer will and effort. When he stood in the centre of the defence, he represented the community's own struggle for recognition and success. Supporters on the Kop saw themselves in him. They saw their own toughness reflected in his play. There is a famous story from the FA Cup presentation in 1965. Yates was being presented to the Queen, and in that formal moment, with all the pomp and circumstance, he told her he was absolutely knackered, exhausted. That is who he was. No pretense. No false modesty. Just honest, authentic, grounded. That is the kind of player and person Yates was. That is why he matters so much in Liverpool's history. How football evolves. By 1973, the game was changing. The defeat to Red Star Belgrade in European competition was a wake-up call. Continental sides were playing patient, technical football. They were building up from the back. They were using the ball rather than just lumping it forward. Shankley and the boot room coaches realised that the brutish stopper style, which Yates had perfected, was not going to be enough anymore, so the club gradually moved toward more versatile defenders. Phil Thompson and Emlyn Hughes came through, players who could bring the ball out of the back and start attacks. Here is the crucial thing. That evolution was only possible because Yates had created the foundation. Without the domestic titles, without the FA Cup victory, without the institutional confidence that Yates had built, Liverpool would never have had the resources or the belief to transform their defensive approach. Yates took a slap-happy club in the 1950s and built it into something that could dominate, first domestically and then globally. That platform allowed everything that came after, the continental evolution, the European dominance of the late 1970s. It all happened because Yates had made sure that Liverpool was strong at the base. When you think about how good Ron Yates was, you have to consider all of this. You have to understand that he was not just tall, he was not just strong, he was a leader, he was a standard setter. He was a symbol of what Liverpool Football Club was becoming. Bill Shankley saw that in 1961 when he looked across at Dundee United and identified this man as the one who could anchor his vision. Sir Bobby Charlton felt it when he stepped onto the pitch and felt suffocated by Yates's dominance. Ian St. John experienced it as the security that allowed him to be brave. Roger Hunt built his goal-scoring legacy on the back of it. Tommy Smith learned the lessons and became the next generation of leaders. Billy McNeil recognized him as a pioneer of a new era. All of those men, they all understood that Yates was foundational. He was the mountain. He was the colossus. He was the architectural necessity of the Shankley Revolution. His presence ensured that when the world looked at Liverpool, they did not just see a football team. They saw a club that was built on rock, a club that was solid, a club that was going somewhere. The memory may have faded in his later years, but the legacy remains crystal clear. Ron Yates was the player who took a nothing club and made it into a bastion of success. He was the defender who inspired attackers. He was the captain who led by example and by standards. He was the working-class hero who embodied the values of the community he represented. That is how good Ron Yates was. That is why the legends remembered him the way they did. That is why his story still matters so much today.
I think I've done that in a wonderfully old famous club like Arsenal. You don't need any persuading about that. So the further away you get from it, the more special it feels. It did, yeah. I mean, George Graham assembled a young, hungry team, brought a lot of lads through from the youth ranks, Tony Adams, Paul Merson, David Rocastle.
How good was Alan Smith? Ian Wright and Tony Adams can tell you. People talk about Arsenal legends. Henry gets statues. Wright gets the charisma. But Alan Smith barely gets shouted about. Here is the twist. The people who played with him and against him describe him like the hidden engine of a title team. The unsung hero. The enabler. Wright called him the best partner he ever had. Tony Adams called him the unsung hero of title wins. George Graham called him one of his best signings. You will see the moments that prove it. Anfield 1989, Copenhagen 1994. If you are enjoying this story already, tap the hype feature to give this video a boost. And let's get into what made Smith so special. Arsenal in 1987 was rebuilding. George Graham was installing discipline and tactical rigidity. The club was emerging from a period of mediocrity, drifting in the shadow of Liverpool's dominance and Everton's resurgence. Graham was dismantling the champagne and slippers culture of the early 80s, replacing it with a regime built on discipline, fitness and tactical structure. Smith arrived from Leicester for £850,000. At the time, this was a significant outlay. particularly for a striker who played for a side fighting relegation. Critics doubted if a tall, somewhat gangly forward from a struggling Midlands club had the pedigree to lead the line for Arsenal. He did not look like a flashy superstar. The team was seen as boring, so he got underrated. But the legends saw something different. Something the statistics did not reveal immediately. Number 5. Alan Mullery framed Smith as the traditional English number 9. He called him the best header of a ball in the country in the late 80s. Not just because of height. Smith stood 6'3", but it was technique. 3 pillars made him special. Timing. He jumped slightly earlier than the defender, securing hang time at the top. Power generation. Neck strength to generate force even when standing still or moving backward. Directional control. He could glance headers with subtle neck movements that goalkeepers could not read. Mullery said Arsenal's strategy of long ball only worked because they had a genius at the end of it. The Anfield 1989 goal is the perfect example. A glancing header from a Winterburn free kick. It skidded off his forehead into the far corner. Technical difficulty at the highest level. Mullery had played in an era of great headers of the ball. He placed Smith in the highest bracket. That recognition from a former England midfielder and respected pundit carried weight. Number 4. Gianfranco Zola faced Smith in the 1994 Cup Winners' Cup final. Parma was loaded with stars. Zola, Asprilla, Brolin, they were the Galacticos of the era, an attacking juggernaut. Arsenal was the underdog. Missing key players. Ian Wright was suspended. John Jensen and Martin Keown were out. Smith was alone up front, isolated against 3 Parma defenders. Zola called Smith's volley the difference maker. The moment came in the 20th minute. Minotti miskicked a clearance. Smith controlled it on his chest, then hit it on the volley with his left foot. It smashed the inside of the post and went in. Zola described it as clinical. In Italian football culture, cinismo is highly prized. Clinical nature, punishing a single defensive error with a technically perfect finish. Smith needed only one chance in a game dominated by Parma, but Zola's key point went deeper. Arsenal's defensive strength started with Smith's work rate at the front. Smith spent 70 minutes chasing and holding up the ball. He pressed the Parma backline alone. Every clearance, every loose ball, it disrupted their rhythm. Because Smith was a constant threat on the counter, Parma could not commit everyone forward. They had to leave defenders back to watch him. It reduced the space Zola had to operate in. Respect from an opponent who knew what it took. Zola admitted this work rate was the difference between victory and defeat. Number 3. Lee Dixon joked that Smith was so nice he would apologise to defenders after scoring. The deeper point is Smith disarmed opponents. In an era of hard men, defenders like Vinnie Jones, Julian Dix and Razor Ruddock, Smith refused to be drawn into physical scraps. He maintained a gentlemanly demeanour. He beat them with technique and intelligence. Dixon praised Smith's football brain. His movement off the ball was the best in the league. As a fullback, Dixon was one of the primary suppliers of crosses into the box. He relied on Smith to be in the right place. Smith made checking runs. He would move towards the near post to drag a defender with him, then stop and peel off to the back post, or vice versa. It created separation for Dixon to pick him out with crosses. The 1994 Cup Winners' Cup final showed their telepathy. Dixon played the ball forward, often described as a clearance, but Dixon might argue it was a pass. Smith controlled it on his chest while being closed down by Minotti. The pass was high and awkward. He let the ball drop and hit the volley on the bounce, using the defender's momentum against him, a goal born from hundreds of training sessions together. Dixon credits Smith with turning a 50-50 ball into a goal. That connection between full-back and striker was vital. Number 2. Ian Wright called Smith the best strike partner he ever had. Think about that claim. Wright played with Mark Bright at Crystal Palace. He played with Dennis Bergkamp at Arsenal, but Smith was the best. Wright said Smith could win everything in the air. It made Wright's job easy. Wright thrived on chaos and broken play, a player of explosive pace and predatory instinct. Smith was the generator of that controlled chaos. The flick-on mechanics worked like this. Smith would position himself to receive a long ball from Seaman or the back four. He would back into the opposition centre-back, often physically dominating them, jump early to secure the aerial space, then glance the ball backward into the the space behind the defensive line. Wright was already sprinting into that space, anticipating the move. Defenders could not double-team Wright. They had to commit one or often two bodies to stopping Smith in the air. It left Wright one-on-one with the remaining defender, a duel Wright rarely lost. The geometry of the play was calculated, not a random header. In the 1991-92 season, Wright won the Golden Boot with 29 league goals. Smith's league goals dropped from 22 the previous season to 12. The statistical shift proves Wright's claim of Smith's unselfishness. Smith accepted a provider role, a subservient role to accommodate Wright. He did the dirty work, battling elbows, challenging for headers, shielding the ball in the corners, so Wright could conserve energy for explosive sprints into the box. Smith reflected on it himself. He called it the classic big man, small man routine, Wright's busy way. All pace and aggression, working next to Smith's target man qualities. That sacrifice earned deep respect from Wright, the kind of respect that lasts decades. Number 1. Tony Adams called Smith the unsung hero of the 1989 and 1991 title sides. Adams praised reliability. For a centre-back, the striker's reliability is everything. Adams' perspective is unique because it comes from the defensive line looking forward. If a striker loses the ball cheaply, the defence is under pressure. If a striker fails to chase down a clearance, the ball comes straight back. Smith never drifted. Adams used the terms rock solid and completely dependable to differentiate Smith from temperamental strikers. In the high-pressure environment of the late 80s First Division, where physical intimidation was rife, many strikers would drift out of games if they were being kicked or if service was poor. Smith never drifted. Adams said Smith provided an outlet that allowed the defence to breathe. When Arsenal were under siege at Anfield or Old Trafford, Adams knew a clearance launched in Smith's direction would likely stick. The 1989 title is remembered for Michael Thomas's last-minute goal at Anfield, but Adams and serious historians know Alan Smith was the architect of that victory. Arsenal needed a 2-goal win. The setup was May 26, 1989, Liverpool versus Arsenal. The narrative is dominated by Thomas, but Smith was the architect. Smith scored the first, a glancing header from a Nigel Winterburn free kick in the 52nd minute. The Liverpool line held deep. Smith made a run across the face of the defenders. He did not power the header. He allowed the ball to skid off his forehead, guiding it into the far corner. Liverpool players disputed it, but Smith's celebration was resolute. Adams points out that without this breakthrough, the tactical panic that gripped Liverpool in the final stages would never have occurred. Thomas's iconic moment does not happen without Smith's goal changing the match. The goal changed the tactical landscape, forcing Liverpool to panic. Adams also highlights Smith's golden boot that season. 23 league goals. While Thomas provided the iconic moment, Smith provided the consistency. He scored a hat-trick on the opening day against Wimbledon, setting the tone for the campaign. Adams viewed Smith as the backbone of the attack, just as Adams was the backbone of the defence. The quiet efficiency angle mattered too. Smith was not a shouter on the pitch, not a raver. In a dressing room full of massive personalities, Adams, Merson, Wright, Groves, Smith was an island of calm. This temperament was crucial for the team's balance. Adams struggled with his own demons and emotional volatility. He leaned on Smith's stability, that emotional anchor in the squad. George Graham loved Smith because he followed tactical instructions exactly, rare for a top striker. The goal greed that drives a striker to score 20-plus goals a season is often at odds with the collective defensive structure a manager like Graham demanded. Graham noted that Smith was a rarity because he combined the output of a Golden Boot winner with the obedience of a defensive midfielder. Smith was not just waiting to score, he helped the team defend from the front. His role was to block passes from opposition centre-backs into midfield. The tactical instruction in Graham's system was complex. It required the striker not merely to wait in the box, but to act as the first line of the screen. Smith was required to position himself precisely to cut off passing lanes, forcing them to play long balls that Arsenal's famous back four could easily win. Adams, Bold, Dixon, Winterburn. These defenders devoured long balls. Graham described it as ploughing a lone furrow, physically exhausting, thankless. Smith did it without complaint. Graham also praised Smith as an all-rounder, not just a penalty box striker, someone who could influence all thirds of the pitch. Smith could drop deep, receive the ball with his back to goal, and bring midfielders into play. This gave Arsenal a dimension they lacked. In the late 80s, English football was dominated by the long ball. Graham used Smith to play effective transitions. The ball would go into Smith's chest. He would hold off a defender, often physically superior centre-backs like Steve Bruce or Gary Pallister, then lay it off to rushing wingers like Brian Marwood or David Rocastle. This hold-up play was the catalyst for Arsenal's counter-attacking potency. Graham saw something the statistics did not reveal immediately: a marvellous team player. The numbers back it up. 2 Golden Boot seasons, 23 league goals in 1988-89. Arsenal won the league. 22 league goals in 1990-91. Arsenal won the league, losing only 1 game. These statistics prove Smith was not just a workhorse. In his prime, he was the most lethal finisher in England. He scored 115 Arsenal goals. Many were headers, derived from crosses by Dixon, Winterburn, Rocastle and Merson. A significant proportion of his goals came from his head, but the 1994 Cup Winners' Cup volley and varied finishes like a hat-trick against Manchester United show the all-rounder quality Graham praised. The trophy cabinet tells the story. League titles in 1988-89 and 1990-91. FA Cup and League Cup in 1992-93. Cup Winners' Cup in 1993-94. Smith was the constant variable in every victory. Every legend quoted played a part in these victories, but all acknowledge that Smith was the constant in the equation. The 2 iconic moments define his legacy. Anfield 1989, the glancing header that changed the match and set up the famous ending. Copenhagen 1994, the left foot volley that punished Parma and won the Cup Winners' Cup. But the deeper legacy is what the legends saw. To Ian Wright, he was the selfless provider, the brother-in-arms who sacrificed his own stats for the partnership. To George Graham, he was the tactical soldier, the manager's dream who executed the low-block strategy from the front. To Tony Adams, he was the reliable rock, the unsung hero who carried the burden of the attack so the defence could stand tall. To Lee Dixon, he was the intelligent technician, the gentleman assassin who apologised before destroying you. To Gianfranco Zola, he was the resilient adversary, the clinical finisher who defined the margin between victory and defeat. To Alan Mullery, he was the master of the air, the custodian of the English number 9 tradition. Alan Smith was not just a scorer, he was the player who made the whole machine work, the keystone, the enabler of that era, the functional pivot who allowed George Graham's rigid system to flourish, who allowed Ian Wright's chaotic brilliance to shine, who allowed Tony Adams's defensive line to remain unbreached. He proved that one could be a prolific scorer and a selfless worker simultaneously. He proved that boring tactics could produce moments of transcendent drama. In the pantheon of Arsenal legends, while Henry has the statues and Wright has the charisma, Smith has the quiet, unshakable respect of every man who ever played with or against him. He was, in every sense, the architect of Highbury. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more football history. Drop a comment. Who is your most underrated Arsenal player? Let me know.